Good morning, everybody, and you're all very welcome to our second MHC webinar on the European Accessibility Act. We decided to do this webinar now as we've just under 3 months to go until the EEA goes live. So we thought it would be a good time to, I suppose, one, make sure everybody's fully briefed on the EEA, which at this stage we hope most people are, but also then to importantly talk about some of our experiences of working on compliance projects and sort of what we are seeing in the market in terms of that. A couple of points of housekeeping before we start. You will have noticed, and it may well still be on your screen, a few poll questions. We would appreciate if you could answer those, and then we'll discuss the results of those at the end of today's session. There's also a Q&A box, so if you have any questions as we go through, please do feel free to put those into the Q&A function. And then finally, at the end of today's webinar, there will be a feedback questionnaire, which again, we would appreciate if you could fill out. And for all the lawyers in attendance, you will get the all-important CPD cert once you fill out that form. So today's session then is, I suppose, a game of two halves, I suppose. So I'm going to do the first half, and then I'm very pleased to say I'm joined by Sonia and John from All Human, who are going to cover the second half of the session. So John and Sonia, if you'd like to just sort of introduce yourselves and just give us a flavour of what you're going to cover, that would be great.
Thank you, Dermot. Delighted to partner with Mason Hayes and Kern on this subject matter, which is very imminent. So today we're hoping to cover some of the more technical, procedural and processes that organizations need to embark in to be compliant with the Accessibility Act as it comes forward. So hopefully give you some tips on the practicalities and some detail on the remedial tasks that can be done by organizations to be accessibility compliant. So hopefully you learn something from today's session.
Great. I'm Sonia St. Clair, and I'm a senior UX specialist and accessibility specialist with All Human. I will be talking you through some of the main issues that we come across and how to address them, and hopefully just get your website compliant.
Great, thanks, guys. So I suppose one of the key advantages of being a private practice lawyer like me is that we get to advise a range of clients across a range of sectors. And what that means in an EEA context is that we get to advise the full sort of scope of in-scope businesses. What that means is that we get an appreciation of the sector-specific challenges, but it also means that we get to see the sort of common themes and issues which emerge across all in-scope businesses. So that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about some of the common challenges and issues that I see in practice and how they are being approached and dealt with. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to step through some of the key issues of the EEA to do that. And the first issue I'm going to talk about, which is the slide on the screen there, is the scope of the legislation. So anybody I think who's heard me talk about the EA before will have heard me say that the EA is not a general accessibility standard. It is rather targeted at a specific list of products and a specific list of services, which are on the slide there. And simply put, if you're a business who isn't involved in one of these products or services, you don't need to worry about the EEA. My experience is on the product side is that sort of side of the house are well sort of versed on the EA and actually have been looking at this for a number of years, remembering that we've had the directive since 2019. I have seen a couple of sort of challenging situations, mainly for non-EU manufacturers who weren't aware of the EEA and perhaps have developed products not knowing that, but that is very much the exception. And actually today's session, we're going to focus on the services side of things. When it comes to service providers, again, my experience is that those which are obviously in scope, so like the banks, the transport companies, they've been well aware of the EEA and well down the path on their compliance projects. Where I see people getting sort of caught out, as it were, is e-commerce. That's the most common one where people are sort of caught by surprise, essentially. So they don't appreciate that they're in scope of the EEA. I think some of that at the start, and I used to get asked this question, was that like, does the e-commerce services actually refer to like the big e-commerce platforms we're all aware of? But the answer to that is no. Because when you look at the broadness of the definition in the legislation itself, when you look at the impact statement that was drafted when the directive was being prepared, when you look at the sort of limited guidance we have from around Europe, and when you look at the recitals of the directive, I think it's clear that if you're a business selling online to consumers, you're in scope of the EEA as an e-commerce provider. My own view actually is that I think there's quite a large number of companies out there who haven't realized that yet. And I think that will come over the sort of short to medium term once the legislation comes into force. The other practical point I just wanted to talk about in relation to scope was that consumer issue. And it works the other way. It sort of de-scopes businesses or certain parts of businesses. So again, sort of simply put, to be an in-scope service provider, you need to be providing your service to consumers. So the two sort of situations I see that, other than people who are just B2B businesses and therefore don't need to worry about it, but the two sort of issues I see in practice are one where a company has a B2B offering and a B2C offering of the same service. And then they don't need to worry essentially about the B2B offering from an EEA perspective. Now they may choose to do things from an accessibility statement or accessibility perspective because, you know, it's a good thing, it's the right thing to do, that's all fine, but they don't need to do it for legal compliance reasons. They need to focus on the consumer offering. And then the second situation is where you have a B2B business whose customers are businesses, but then they almost immediately use the service with consumers. And there's a wee bit of a gray area around that, and there's some discussion, but my personal view is that if you're a B2B business and you're providing your service to customers, they're paying your invoice, your contract is with a business, you're not providing your service to consumers, and therefore you're not directly subject to the EEA. In practice, it means that there's a business imperative to make sure that your service is compliant, and therefore you might end up in the same place in terms of what your service looks like. But that's different from being subject to the risk arising from the EA, essentially the compliance risk, like enforcement and that type of stuff. If you're not in scope, you don't need to worry about that type of thing. So we just turn to the next slide, please, Rebecca. So then, if you are in scope, what does it mean? What it means is that you need to comply with the accessibility requirements, essentially. And again, very basically, there's a list of general requirements which apply to all services, and then there's a broadly shorter list which applies to each specific service. So there's a specific list for e-commerce, for consumer banking services, etc. The one that I wanted to talk about now is point C on that slide, which is about making websites and apps, etc., perceivable, operational, understandable, and robust. Because that's the requirement where the lack of lack of harmonized standards is causing a bit of an issue. So again, just a quick explainer on the harmonized standards piece. So the European Standardization Organization was asked to prepare 6 standards, essentially 3 which are totally new, and then 3 which are uplifting existing standards to bring them up to the standard they need to be to for EEA. The relevant one for what we're talking about here is the standard which was prepared for the public sector requirements around accessibility, so those regulations, which is EN 301549. The value of the harmonized standards is twofold, really. One is that it gives you sort of detail which you can act against, so like meat on the bone, as it were, of that relatively high level requirement. And then the second one is from a legal perspective, there's a presumption of conformity that if you are in conformity with the harmonized standards, you're presumed to be in conformance with the relevant requirement, which is great, obviously. The problem, which I've mentioned already, is that we don't have the harmonized standards yet. So we were told sort of back end of last year we were going to have drafts early this year. We're obviously in April now. We haven't had the drafts yet. There's been some discussion about dates, but I think the thing which we can safely assume, is that we're not going to have a finalized harmonized standard by the 28th of June, certainly around this issue. So in practice then, what I'm seeing is people looking for what else can we use. So people are using WCAG standards, people are looking at actually that EN 301 standard as well, because, you know, in practice you need some kind of practical guide you can use, and John and Sonia are going to talk about that in a wee bit more detail, and that's absolutely fine. But I think the sort of the legal nuance to understand is that there isn't a presumption of conformity for WCAG or the old standard, because they don't actually have legal standing under the EEA. But that's just the situation we're in because we don't have the finalized harmonized standard. So Rebecca, if you wouldn't mind, just the next slide, please. So the requirement to have accessibility statements is, again, obviously something I'm working with quite a lot of clients on. I mean, these are documents that you need to provide information in your terms and conditions or equivalent document describing how you meet the relevant requirements, so the accessibility requirements, and this needs to be published by the 28th of June. The placement issue, so the one I've referred to in the slide there, is probably the first point I'm talking to a lot of clients about. And there are various options, there's, does go in your T's and C's, what is an equivalent document? If you put it your T's and C's, what does that look like? That type of thing. And there's a sort of list of options, and there's pros and cons to each from a compliance perspective, but also really importantly from a practical perspective. And this is the sort of point that I'm seeing a lot, that some businesses updating your T's and C's is a big undertaking and actually only happens every couple of years and that type of thing. So I'm seeing some businesses where it's just practically they can't make amendments to their T's and C's. So they're having to look at the equivalent document, the alternatives and that type of thing. So I think a lot of the time what I'm finding is we can present the options, but where a business ends up is a lot of time guided by their own practical reality of where they're at, and the way they communicate with their consumer or their customers. So then the accessibility statement itself, like the content of it, I mean, it's very basically, there's a wee bit more to it, but very basically it's what are your accessibility requirements and how have you met them? So in practice, what we sort of talk to clients about is you sort of start with the detail. You start with, well, here's what we know our requirements are, and here's what we've done. And you start with that sort of longer form document, and then you mold that down into something which is meaningful for your users, for your customers. And that's important because I think like a 10-15 page accessibility statement, I don't think is going to work, because it's not going to be meaningful or understandable for people. And there's that sort of consumer law overlay as well, that things need to be understandable for consumers generally. So it's important to sort of make sure that it's presented properly, as well as the legal issue. There's actually a marketing issue as well there, because remember, this is a correspondence with your customer base essentially. So there's always a marketing angle to it, in terms of the way it's presented, in terms of the way it's phrased. And I think importantly as well, I mean, if you have spent a significant amount of time and money complying with the EEA, you should have a best-in-class accessibility statement, and you should shout it from the rooftops, because you should get the value out of the work that has been put in, both from a compliance perspective, but equally, and if not more, to be honest, from a sort of customer goodwill perspective. And then the other point on accessibility statements is that you want to avoid them inviting unnecessary risk. So you want to be careful about sort of statements which are like hostages to fortune, which are like forward-looking statements and things like that. I'm always quite nervous about those, because one, are you sure you're definitely going to do them? And two, it suggests an element of non-compliance, which is obviously not where you want to be. You want to be saying on the 20th of June, we're in compliance and here's how we've done it. So that's part of the sort of exercise we do with a lot of clients. So Rebecca, if you wouldn't mind, just the next slide, please. So yeah, the transitional measures. So this is one of the other sort of things people look at a lot. I mean, I've included them on the slide there. I mean, A and C, you need to be using products in providing your service. So obviously they don't apply if you're a purely digital offering. Important to remember as well, they're talking about products which are in scope of the EEA. And then so B is the one I think a lot of businesses looked at. And again, if anybody who attended the session in October would have heard me say that, you know, this transitional measure B there on the face of it looks great, looks really helpful. We've got 5 years to fix this. But actually, when you look at the detail, it's not that, and its utility in practice can be relatively limited. And actually, my experience to date has borne that out. And I think the reason for that is quite simple, is because what this transitional measure is talking about is service contracts which are in place now. So customer contracts that you have in place now. So if most online businesses, that's their terms of service, or their T's and C's. So that's existing customers. What it doesn't cover, obviously, is a customer who signs up on the 29th of June. So if you were going to rely on this, you would essentially have two cohorts of customers, and you would have two streams of your service. You would have one for existing customers and one for new customers. Now, there are some very large and sophisticated tech companies that I work with who can do that, actually. But most businesses I work with look at that and say, actually, that's more expensive than doing the remediation work for the EEA. And my own personal view is that was probably the intention when they drafted it, because the EEA generally, there was clearly a policy driver when they were drafting this to make it as generally applicable as possible. If you wouldn't mind, Rebecca, just the next slide, please. So yeah, the derogations. So again, these are things that people can rely on. So you don't have to meet an accessibility requirement, as I put in the slide there, to the extent that you can rely on one of these derogations. In practice, actually, I haven't seen many clients get into the weeds on them yet. I think there's probably two reasons for that. One is the timing. That, you know, I think actually that'll change in the next 3 months, because people will get down to the nub of things and realize actually there's some stuff we just can't do here, and they'll start looking at the derogation. So I think there's the timing piece. But then the second point, and to be honest, this is my advice to most clients as well, is that you shouldn't rely on a derogation unless you absolutely have to, because these derogations will be interpreted narrowly. And I think they do invite an element of regulatory scrutiny as well. So if you are going to rely on one of these, you need to be very sure of your ground on the reasons as to why. And then, I mean, what do they mean in practice? So the first one, you know, it talks about significant change, fundamental alteration, the basic nature of the service. That comes out of a technical analysis. So that comes from a technical place. And I think that has to be the justification. Whereas B, the disproportionate burden, is about cost, essentially, you know. So that's you know, that obviously varies from business to business, because businesses are a different scale, they have different sort of cash flow. Important to remember, though, and similar to the point I mentioned about these will be interpreted narrowly, the recitals in the directive are clear that on B, the disproportionate burden, a lack of priority, time, and knowledge aren't a justification to rely on this. So if a company only realizes after this webinar that they're in scope with the EEA and they realize, oh God, we don't have time to do all this, that was a lack of knowledge, that's a lack of time. You won't be able to look at derogation B here, I'm afraid. And yeah, it's just my general advice, as I say, is don't rely on a derogation unless you have to. But if you have to, absolutely grand, and do it properly, because there's documentation requirements and things like that around which do need to be complied with. And then just the next slide, please, Rebecca. And this is just the last couple of points from me. So the first one is about reporting non-compliance. And this is a thing people are asking more and more about, obviously, because we're getting sort of down to it now. We're getting close to the go live date. And this is essentially where you realize, or you know by the 20th of June, that you're not in compliance with some or all of the requirements, that you need to make a report to the relevant regulator or regulators, and you need to give details of that, as we've said in the slide there, what is the non-compliance and what corrective measures are being taken. So it's a pretty simple and pretty clear obligation. Like, you need to make this report if you're not in compliance. I think there's sort of strategy to it though, and there's technique to these types of regulatory reporting which need to be applied. I mean, there's no one size fits all, because again, if you go to the example I just talked about, somebody in this webinar just realizes they're in it, and they get to the 20th, or they're in scope and get to the 20th of June, and actually they've done very little. That's a very different report to a business who have been working in this for a significant period of time and just haven't got over the line, but know they will get over the line with everything by a specific date. They're very different reports. The second one, I think, invites relatively limited scrutiny and probably limited follow-up, whereas the second type of report is of course different, and I think is going to be scrutinized more, and you need to be ready for that. And then the final point is just on enforcement risk. Obviously a very important issue from a legal perspective. Again, those who attended February session will have heard me talk about how, while there are absolutely penalties, there's the risk of regulatory action, there's potential liability for company officers, which are all important issues. The biggest sort of day one concern from an enforcement perspective for me is still that claim being brought by a motivated consumer who's perhaps backed up by an interest group. I think how big a risk for you that is, again, depends on your business. And I think there's two key factors. One is, how high profile is your business in your sector? The higher profile you are, of course, the more risk there is of this. And the second point, which I think gets missed a wee bit, is how many players are there actually in your sector? So if it's e-commerce, for example, it's a very wide, pool. Whereas if it's something like banking, say, it's more limited. So I think those two factors need to be borne in mind when you're considering this issue from a risk perspective. And then one of the points I relatively commonly get asked about this now, and primarily actually I think from clients who are based in the US, is the risk of damages claims in this context. So my understanding is that it is the case in certain states in the US that there can be damages claims arising from non-compliance with accessibility laws. So the EEA, the comfort I can give around that is that the EEA doesn't specifically envisage that. What the EEA, certainly the Irish implementation of it, envisages is that there would be an order of non-compliance and you're told to bring it into compliance. Now, the legislation is very clear that it's up to the court, so it's as it sees fit as to what order it brings, and that is consistent with the court always having discretion. But it's pretty clear that there are, there's the options which are set out in the legislation, and I think it would take something pretty egregious, impactful, and actually has caused loss for the court, an Irish court certainly, to depart from that and start looking at monetary damages. And actually, it's quite hard to think of something like that in an EEA context. Okay, so I mean, I'll finish up there. I hope that's been helpful. Very happy to take questions in the Q&A box, and very happy if anybody wants to follow up with a question by email. That's totally fine as well. So thanks very much, and I'll just pass over to John and Zanya now for their part of the session.
Thank you, Dermot. I'll just wait for my colleagues to join. Thank you, everybody, for attending this morning. This hopefully is part 2 of the session that Dermot alluded to, and is hopefully a practical guide to some of the things that we observe in practice. So, Rebecca, if you just go on to the next slide, please. Yeah, just unabashed sort of PR here for All Human, just by way of intro, but more relevant to the audience here is that we are presenting our work at a global level. So that gives us an opportunity to really see where the variable standards of accessibility compliance are in existence, both at a European level and internationally. If you'd like to go on to the next slide, please. And just from my own perspective, just super quick introduction. Regularly advise organizations, both public and private sector, on what accessibility compliance looks like at a general level. And I suppose that has hopefully gives some practical tips and guidance today based on that experience. Zanya, do you want to intro yourself?
Yep, sorry, I just lost my mute button there. Yeah, I have about 20 years experience, I suppose, with digital products and accessibility auditing as well. So just kind of bringing that little bit of expertise into today's webinar.
Thank you, Zanya. So maybe go on to the next slide. There's going to be lots of next here, Rebecca. So more relevantly is that we are, as I said, in the theater as such, advising and running audits and doing the implementation and the remediation for organizations. And we share that view that Dermot espoused, that, particularly in an e-commerce context, and be it in utilities or banking, there is a material risk in terms of that motivated consumer in the future post enactment. And our experience has been, adhering to, in many ways, the public sector has been ahead of the pack in terms of its adherence to NDA and NCBI standards of the domestic market in Ireland. So government adherence to YCAG, which is the placeholder in advance of the harmonised standard, in many cases have shown best in class. It's now becoming transcended into the private sector. So that's where our experience has been built out initially, is adhering to standards, both at a governmental level and laterally into the private sector. So if you want to go on to the next slide. Yeah, and click maybe 3 times, please, Rebecca. Thank you. Yeah, so at a very reductive level, the approach that we typically take is that early assessment, and I'll expand on that shortly. And that assessment typically includes an automated testing tool, typically a third-party tool, combined with a manual set of triages and assessments that then naturally elicits and highlights a range of fixes and remediation tasks that need to be done, typically on a website, sometimes on a native app product. And that remediation is really the checklist of fixes that need to be resolved to adhere to a compliant level. And then the third part of the process is that ongoing maintenance and monitoring. So this is not a one fix. It is an ongoing adherence to compliance. So if you'd like to go on to the next slide, please. So just to really expand on what assessment looks like in a practical sense, if you please go on to the next slide. Yeah, ultimately, the starting place for most organizations, whether they're commissioned by organizations like ourselves or independently themselves, is to run an audit, to assess that snapshot of where the level of compliance or non-compliance is against a range of criteria. And I note some of the questions coming from the Q&A. There is a trifecta of typically design, content, and technology or developmental tasks, and broadly speaking, accessibility compliance falls into those 3 buckets, and they're quite interlinked. So the accessibility audit gives a snapshot of where your digital asset is standing in respect of the YCAG, and I can't emphasize enough that YCAG is the standard that is being used and applied pending the finalization of the harmonized standard, as Dermot alluded to. If you go on to the next slide, please. So there's a multiplicity of different tooling that can be used, and we're happy to share this this deck later on if it's of interest to all attendees. Some are enterprise level with a quite a high ticket price depending on the need for the organization. Some are free, some are paid, and increasingly we're seeing an AI dimension to a lot of the tools that are used to give that initial snapshot of compliance. And as I said, they typically test against a range of criteria, which I'll show you shortly. You know, and you know, some are open source, some are paid, and some are subscription. If you'd like to go on to the next slide. Or you can partner with an accessibility expert. If you go on to the next slide, please. So in our opinion, I think it's a combination of automation, testing, and manual evaluation, because quite often the tools are not exhaustive. They can miss some of the finer points around deeper content non-compliance, or finer points of detail around developmental and engineering gaps that often get really identified as you do a kind of a manual review. So the utopian state is to run an initial audit using a tool to get that sort of impartial, independent assessment, and then augment that with a manual review as well. So you can really kind of get into the detail and the weeds of what are the identified issues that need to be resolved. Rebecca, if you'd like to go on to the next slide. So typically an audit will elicit a number of things. It will list the issues to be fixed naturally. It will also rank them by severity in terms of their impact on an audience with visual impairment. And it will obviously give you a quantum of lists. So, you know, you're really on the naughty step if you get a high list, a high quantum of issues that are of a high severity level. And they're issues that typically tend to be prioritized in order of prioritization. If you'd like to go on to the next slide, please. At a very simplistic level, you know, this is just a compendium of the typical types of outputs you get from an automated report. And it typically gives a general conformance level for your site, or, you know, or your sites if it's plural. So just a general kind of macro scoring, which is your conformance level. And then typically it gives you that ranking of severe down to moderate down to minor in order of ranking. And more often than not, the more enterprise tools will give you a more granular breakdown of the top issues. And I'll expand on some of those in the next slide, please, Rebecca. And this relates to homepage in particular. So common things that get highlighted or spotlighted on an accessibility audit is, you know, things like contrast on text. And I know there was a question in the Q&A around what is an example of a non-compliant or non-accessible content. But things like missing alternative text, missing form labels, empty links, empty buttons, missing document language, they're typically content fails. But they're not necessarily just content or copy. Some of them relate to technical gaps as well. And really just to expand on that, you know, one of the, you know, that question around what examples of non-compliant or non-accessible content, it's, you know, it can be anything up to and including images without alt text. And alt text is critical for screen reader technology. It can be video without captions or transcripts. A serial offender is complex PDFs as attachments. More often than not, they're unstructured and can be legacy PDFs. And that can often require an onerous clean out of content and remediation content. Technical things like lack of keyboard navigation, content that's just color dependent, and that can really have an issue with color contrast. Autoplay videos without controls, for example, and generally inaccessible forms are often serial offenders that get highlighted in the accessibility audit. So there, you will see that there's not, sometimes it's not clear water between written content or copy. Sometimes it's a combination of the content within a technical format as well. So the lines are blurred between the coding and the design adherence and the content. If you'd like to go on to the next slide. I'll hand over to you to Zania just to kind of walk the audience through, you know, the types of remediation that is involved once you've run that audit, both automated and manual.
Great, thanks, John, and thanks, Dermot, before it. Yeah, I'll take you through kind of the steps on how to prioritize the issues that are identified in your audit, and also just some of the main considerations for designers, developers, and content creators. So next slide there. Yes, mentioned again, I suppose the final standards are still in waiting and pending. Kind of Dermot mentioned and John mentioned, there's 6 harmonized standards that are being created for companies to use to comply with the EAA. We still don't have these yet. For now, we recommend using the WCAG guidelines standards for digital products. So when on the outset on doing your audit, these are the checkpoints that you should be checking your digital products against. So next slide there. Thank you. So you have your audit, you have your list of issues, the blockers for accessibility. Really what's next and how do you implement these? As John mentioned, your report should have a comprehensive list of the issues marked by severity. Ideally, you'll have an external agency or someone in-house that is an accessibility expert that's able to read, understand, and implement these fixes. So what we would recommend is prioritize any critical issues, look at the high impact issues first, focus on the most visited pages such as the homepage and key landing pages, and then create a roadmap triaging the most critical issues on the highest traffic pages and working your way through the entire list of fixes. Hopefully some of your fixes might be template based, so header, footer, navigation. So starting with those will have an effect on the entire website. So yeah, just taking it one by one and prioritizing those. I'll go on to the next slide then, just we'll talk through some of, I suppose, where it lies with kind of the different contributors to your digital products. So in hindsight, after your audit, you'll see that there's lots of contributors to creating and maintaining accessible products. These are some of the main kind of standards or the guidelines that we look at for designers. I won't talk through them one by one. Color contrast, links that make sense, and just really having a good design system is probably our top tip. For most of our brands, we would create an accessible brand design system from the outset and maintaining that as your digital product goes. And that will help prevent, I suppose, issues in the long run. It's always advisable if you don't have one now to go back and maybe do that. So anything that you design, you can ensure will be accessible. Next slide, I'll just speak a little bit about developers. Some of the kind of the top ones here are like semantic HTML structure, using ARIA labels, and just looking at kind of assistive technology and see how the code and your HTML is being read. Really look at the structure of your pages and make sure everything's marked up with the correct tags. And then not really a guideline in itself, but it's imperative that your developers and prompters know how to implement and prioritize an accessibility audit, and that testers know what to test with those assistive technologies. And finally, just to go on to content creators, the content of your website shouldn't really remain static and it should be updated regularly. For this reason, it's really important to train your content creators and to make sure that they're well versed with the accessibility requirements. For people who are using your CMS or writing content, blogs, or any information for your site, it's important that they know how to use descriptive page titles, meaningful headings and structure, that they mark up lists properly, that they add meaningful text to images, or if there's video content, that they are able to add supporting accessible content to those. Yeah, I think that's a quick overview. I've run through it quite fast, so I'll hand you back to John, who will talk you through some more considerations, and then feel free to ask any questions.
Thank you, Sonia. If you'd like to go on to the next slide, please. Yeah. So this slide comes with a massive health warning because one of the things that we wanted to do is to try and kind of give some degree of magnitude of where is that inflection point, when you get for example, if you get a very modest set of recommendations from the audit, then it can require a very low level of fixes. We've seen organizations who have run an audit and there's very, very minor corrective things to be done to really to materially improve the percentage scoring in terms of their compliance levels. And that can range from something as modest as a number of days of interventionist work and up to something approximating a number of months of considered work. We've worked with an organization where they had to invest in of the order of about 2 to 3 months of work, largely focused on content. And that effort really, really materially impacted on a positive accessibility compliance. So that's really in the remediation kind of class. So that's kind of type A. Oftentimes we've often seen where, a long standing or a legacy set of web infrastructure or websites have been, published for many, many years, have been authored and content has been updated over many, many years. And you get that classic kind of accretion of content and PDFs and so forth. And it becomes a kind of a margin call then to really move into a consideration around redesign. Because invariably working on greenfield, new code, new content, new structure, new design systems can really, really kind of get that accessibility compliance baked into a redesign from the get-go. So it is a margin call, and I'm not going to be precise on this, but it can be everything from a complete refactor of the front end, and that includes design and build, to include content, and that could be anything from 3 months up to X. But just want to kind of just illustrate that point that sometimes it can be very minor, but in other cases, organizations that really are materially concerned about compliance and take it seriously, which I believe they will with this act, there may be a business case for a full front end redesign or overhaul of your website. So if you'd like to move on to the next slide, please. So you've run the audit, you've got your list, your naughty list. You now have done all the remediation. You're back on Santa's good list, and not to be trivialize it, but you've made that investment as an organization to make those corrective changes. It's about the ongoing piece that is every bit as important, because the enactment is not a one moment in time. It is a continuous exposure in terms of that, whether it's that motivated consumer risk or it's regulatory, or it's some compliant organization or some accreditation body at a European level that is going to kind of start to score providers, be they utility, banking, e-commerce, whatever the sector is. Monitoring and maintaining the standards is critical. So if you'd like to go on to the next slide, please. Again, to be very simplistic about this, there are 3 obvious ways, which is to run the testing annually, and to utilize that tool on an ongoing basis to kind of run it. It doesn't need to be run every 12 months. It can be run, continuously every month, but certainly to kind of indent that annual review as a very practical thing to do, augment that with a manual test as well. And I know one of the questions about ownership in the Q&A that's come up on this session, in many ways embedding accessibility as a kind of a learning and development culture, particularly relevant to content authoring and editorial, is really, really important. But also in terms of the commissioning of new website enhancements, new user flows, new campaign launches, new landing pages. Whoever the party responsible for that is, to ensure that, what has been remediated in the fix phase, as we call it, is not unpicked or kind of degraded over time. So that can be a combination of training and ongoing adherence to standards. And, related to that is the question of general ownership. And, accessibility is a funny one because it sits across a number of different functions. It sits across a CMO, brand, communications category of internal stakeholders, but it also has a technology CTO technology dimension to it as well. So it is transcendent across organizations, Naturally, in smaller organizations, you typically have, you know, kind of a webmaster or a product owner who is responsible for the output of the website. But at a larger enterprise level, you know, it ticks all of those boxes. It touches up against regulatory compliance, it touches against CSR, you know, it touches against inclusion, it touches against brand equity. So, you know, depending on the size of the organization, ownership does need to be taken seriously, and there does need to be one owner. And you know, it does tend to be transcendent across different functions, but because it has a design, technology, and content dimension to it, and that trifecta can make ownership a little bit fuzzy sometimes. If you'd like to go on to the next slide, and the next one. So yeah, just as I alluded to before, we work across public and private sector, and in many ways, a lot of the kind of the learnings that we've adopted in terms of our experience in this area is really working initially through public sector and state agency bodies who've really had that annual report annually in the domestic market. The National Disability Authority produces a report for compliance against WCAG standards. It's like a sort of Damocles that gets published every year. And, you know, in many ways, state agencies and state bodies, central government and so forth, you know, really take adherence to that WCAG standard quite seriously. So, but what I want to do is also kind of reassure that, you know, this can be a very positive investment for your organization as well. If you'd like to go on to the next slide. Yeah, and I think it's very important to reiterate that it does not necessarily mean a diminution or you know, a reduction in the quality of your digital product or experience, or by extension, whether you're in B2B or B2B to B2C, that the customer experience does not necessarily need to be degraded or you know, reduced as a consequence of strict accessibility compliance. They are not mutually exclusive. So maybe by way of example, we might just show you some quick examples just to kind of contextualize it. So for Visit Dublin, you know, a site that we worked on over a recent period, naturally needs to be very visually engaging because it's selling a product proposition. And in this instance, if you'd like to go on to the next slide, the application of, you know, as Zonia alluded to, in the design category, a very structured design system, you know, has allowed the site to pick up some very relevant awards to this subject matter, which include Best Universal Design and the Universal Design and Inclusion Awards late last year. So it just to illustrate the point that when that adherence to those standards are done with a degree of rigor, and you will see quite often the application of a brand design system, color palettes, that's really where the design elements can really have that rigor and formality to adhere to the ongoing standards. If you'd like to go on to the next piece. Similarly for Waterways Ireland, again, another state agency, but, you know, consumer facing and increasingly moving towards a kind of an e-commerce domain. Again, similarly, a design system was put in situ. But if you'd like to go on to the next slide, please, Rebecca, it wasn't just at the design palette side. It's also compliant on some of the more complex technical interactions in terms of form fill and date selection and so forth. So as I mentioned repeatedly, you know, sometimes it's on the visual layer, but it's also on the coding layer that the compliance is really needs to be considered. And if you'd like to go on to the next slide, please. And also, you know, great party to work with on Post, who are very committed to compliance at all stages. And one of the kind of techniques that we'd adopted for them that is really practical is a color palette accessibility matrix. Doesn't roll off the tongue, but think of it as a digital swatch. It is a set of you know, ancillary color contrasts that can work against the accessibility standards, but it allows for design freedom and rich experiences nonetheless. But the maintenance of that, and back to the ownership within the organization, the adherence and the maintenance of that standard, so it does not degrade, and that there's a degree of governance over that, has allowed that adherence to continue forward. Next slide, please. And yeah, Discover Ireland, you know, again, very rich user experience, a lot of content, a lot of visual imagery, naturally, because it's positioning a product. And if you'd like to go on to the next slide, please. You know, this is an example of site from a design point of view. Again, we worked to develop a design system for that rigor, very strong adherence to heading structure, navigation, keyboard navigation, and tab order, alt text for all images, so the screen readers can consume the content for those with visual impairment. Things like response design and touch target. So to expand the touch target area within some of the buttons and calls to actions is a very, very important technique for accessibility compliance. And then kind of behind the visual layer, ongoing scanning of the compliance of the code. And then, comms, disclosure of the limitations of some of the coding. And then, trying to get that sort of balance between accessibility compliance and good user experience. So that's kind of an ongoing value judgment between good coding and good design standards. And as you see up on top, that's a site that's winning at an international level. So here's an example of, good user experience, accessibility, adherence, working in tandem. And if you'd like to go on to the last slide. Yeah, just to reiterate that point that, accessibility compliance should not be seen as a distressed purchase, or it is actually a positive investment in brand reputation. And, in our experience, running that audit, running those remedial fixes, and organizations having ownership internally for the ongoing monitoring and adherence to that can be a really, really positive accelerant for brand reputation, and not tokenistically, but can really, really enhance brand. So maybe go on to the last slide. And yeah, so look, as Dermot will wrap up shortly, happy to advise in partnership with Mason, Hayes and Kern. Hopefully the combination of the Dermot's legal competency and some of the practical stuff that we see in theatre, as I say, is a good combination, and hopefully you gain some value from this morning.
Great. Thanks very much, Jonathan. I'd definitely echo that point about monitoring and maintaining. So it's not like, you get to the 26th of June and that's it, job done. And there's actually an obligation in the EA around that to make sure you're monitoring and maintaining. So that's important to remember. So I think, yeah, we'll just have a quick chat through a few poll results, and then we'll take a couple of questions. So thanks very much, Rebecca. So I think everybody can see those. So do you believe your organization is prepared for EA compliance? Evenly split, which I don't think that has significantly changed from when we asked that question in October, which is slightly concerning, but I'm sure that'll move up as we get closer to the deadline. And then what is your biggest challenge in compliance? So technical implementation there. So hopefully John and Zonia's session might have provided some guidance on that, because that's the biggest concern there. That's quite interesting actually. Yeah, so cost and expertise are much more limited concerns. Have you conducted an audit? Again, sort of even enough split. And again, hopefully what John and Zonia just talked about there sort of demonstrates the importance of that. How confident are you of your organization's understanding? Again, relative even split. Now this poll was before the session, so hopefully after the session that number will be slightly higher on yes. And then yeah, this question 5 is quite interesting about the who drives it. And actually, I'm not surprised that is sort of relatively evenly split between the 4 answers, because I think John mentioned it there in his part of the session as well, that like the EEA sometimes seems to sort of fall between the stools in businesses, and that's been my experience as well, actually. And I think that's part of the reason that some businesses are slightly slower in coming to terms with it, because there isn't that obvious sort of, oh yeah, this is definitely a tech issue, or this is definitely a legal issue. It's sort of it falls between those. I don't know, John, does that sort of chime with your experience as well?
Yeah, it does. I think it can definitely fall between different stakeholders. If that's the correct question you're asking me. It definitely, those parties within organizations commissioning digital products, and they can often be e-commerce owners, or from a commercial team. It can often be in the service context. I note some questions around app compliance as well, and I think it can fall into that orbit as well. But ultimately it has to be at a kind of a corporate level. I believe that there needs to be a kind of commissioning or that air cover at a corporate level to say, look, this is where ownership for compliance lives. And whether that's shared within a comms CMO layer or a CTO layer, I think it needs to be probably both.
Yeah, I think it definitely needs to come from the top down. Really need to educate your teams and just have I suppose, a level of accountability and measurement within your teams and within your processes. So it should be within every process from ideation to the end product. And yeah, accountability, I suppose, for people who are creating the products.
Yeah, well, that's great, guys. Thank you. And then the awareness among customers. Yeah, I'd agree with this. I think there's quite a high level of unawareness amongst the sort of general public and consumers about this. I think that's going to change as time goes on. But yeah, no, I would agree that that's still probably the situation, but I think that will definitely change over time.
It's just another point to add, Dermot, is the complexity around, and I know, so I'm just reading some of the Q&A coming in about third-party plugins. Obviously in an e-commerce context, you're naturally going to be interacting potentially with things like chatbots and third-party plugins. So, again, they all have to fall within the accessibility audit scope, because they are part of the broad digital experience that is within your responsibility. So, while that level of compliance can be perceived sometimes as living within the domain of the tool or technology that you've invested in as part of your customer experience, ultimately responsibility could lie either directly or indirectly with you, particularly in the context of a motivated consumer risk. So you do need to take a kind of a wide lens when it comes to what you control and commission as your own real estate, your owned media, your owned website real estate. But if it's interacting with third-party systems, you just need to be very vigilant around that as well.
Okay. Yeah, so just a couple of questions very briefly. I mean, I think we've actually answered some of the questions going through. I mean, one of the questions was around that stakeholder issue about who has responsibility for it. And I think, as we said, it's sort of it is actually spread across the organization. There was quite a few questions about the harmonized standards and sort of linking it into that reporting obligation, and the theme of the question seems to be, can we use the lack, or is it permissible to sort of say essentially we don't have the harmonized standards and therefore that's why we haven't complied? The simple answer to that is no. The harmonized standards are meant to be a tool for compliance. They're not, the thing you have to meet, as it were. The thing you have to meet is the accessibility requirements in the legislation. So and that would probably be one of my comments if somebody sent me a document saying this is what we're reporting to say to regulators, that I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't raise the lack of harmonized standards as being an issue, because that's not actually what they're about, or how they're set up in the legislation. You always have to just go back to these are the accessibility requirements we're subject to, and that's what your accessibility statement will talk about. And then there was a question about examples of accessibility statements as well, if there's any of these. I mean, again, rather unhelpfully, there probably will be in the accessibility or harmonized standards once we get them, but there aren't. I've heard some rumors about some in a couple of member states, which may come out before the deadline. The point of caution, though, I just wanted to mention is, so there are accessibility statements out there, obviously, in people's websites. They're not EEA accessibility statements. They're accessibility statements arising from work people have done previously. If they're a private sector organization where they've just done accessibility for their own purposes. So just be careful about the sort of Googling for accessibility statements. I think just be careful on that. So guys, that's dead on 12 o'clock. So we'll stop there. I'll just finally say thanks very much to John and Zanya. It was great to hear from you, and that was a very interesting session. And thanks very much for everybody who attended. And that's us for today. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks everyone.